One of the things I got from one of the lads that I work with in Kieran's this morning by text message was, when you're down there, make sure and have a good nose around, because obviously Kieran's and Flannan's long time had a tradition of competing against each other in hurling. I did exactly that, and I was having a look around the classrooms and the different setup here, and I met one of the young fellas who's just walked into the room, not to embarrass him. And I asked him, what was the story with facilities? How many pitches had you here in the college? Because we're proud of the fact in Kieran's we've got 5 full-size pitches. So he proceeded to tell me that you've got 7. And then he went on for about 5 minutes describing the rest of the facilities that you have in gymnasiums and fully equipped, and then really added insult to injury by telling me, but they also have access to a hurling club that's out the back here. I really began to think we haven't a hope competing against Flannan's again, until when I asked him when was the last time you won an All-Ireland up here in colleges. He pointed out that the last time you won a Harty. Now, I think that's the root of all problems with Munster hurling, is the fact that colleges think that Harty are the All-Ireland when they're not. If right was right, I'd be planning a quick exit after today's talk, for loads of obvious reasons.
Kelly, agus fear ghail í Loughlin, agus in Chiat. James Gunning of Franca shoot.
When Albert originally asked me to do this, I said I would, and I was asked to do another gig in Waterford, and I said, yeah, I could talk at that. But when I was saying yes to both of them, and I don't mean this in any arrogant or flippant way, I immediately thought, well, what about All-Irelands and what about replays? Will any of them impact on that? And I agreed to do this talk without realizing that the under-21 final, of course, is played today. So I rang Albert one night with a bit of stress saying, it's a bit of a problem with the talk. The under-21 will be on that day. If you're scheduling me to talk in the afternoon, I'm afraid I'm going to have to decline. I won't be able to come down and do it. I will, however, talk if it's in the morning because I can slip away. Now, all of this was based on the presupposition that after the under-21 final last year, when Clare gave Kilkenny, without exception, a lesson in hurling, we had hoped that we'd get a chance to come back and have a bite at it again this year. Clare, as you all very well know, made it to the under-21 final, but down in Wexford Park, Wexford had something to say about my plans for the summer. I was suddenly freed up. I could stay for the week if he wanted me. Friends of mine in the States were onto me. They were over here at the start of the summer, and I took them down with the under-21s. We played a challenge match against Cork, and I took them down, and I was trying to explain a bit of the hurling, and when the match started, I told them to go away from me and leave me alone, and I'd see them after the match. And they were on after their week or two here to say, well, you'll come back this summer, Dermot, because I have a tradition of trying to get over there for a week during the summer. And I said I won't, because I said I'm kind of half involved in the under-21 thing, and I won't be able to get away, and it's important for me, so no, I won't get over there. They saw the game. They saw the passion that's involved in hurling, but they still couldn't get the logic of someone who was prepared to say, no, I won't take a week off because I want to see a match. I won't take time away from Kilkenny, from the rain, from the muck, the dirt, the misery, and all that goes with being in Ireland of a normal summer. Thankfully, it was exceptional, because I want to see a sport. Unless you're involved in sport, you cannot appreciate the importance that it has in your life. Sport, when you commit to it totally, will dominate everything that you do. From the time you get up, for the food you take on board, to the time you'll go to bed, it begins to shape your every existence. And even for someone like me, who has some moderate knowledge of sport, I still can't fully understand it on occasion. I can't for the life of me figure out how it is that Barry Kelly managed to give the first, not to mind the second, yellow card to Henry Shefflin. From where I was sitting in the stand, I couldn't see that either of them merited any yellow card at all. But then, thankfully, the GAA have long since figured out that the guy who's sitting up in the stand, shout and roar as he may, is not the one making the decisions. Now, lest at this stage you're sitting here and saying, oh Lord, we came to listen to a talk about faith and culture in today's world, and the Wally that they got from Kilkenny is going to stand here and talk about hurling for the day. I'm not. I'll also acknowledge a sport that exists west of the Shannon, rugby. Because of my height and size, I played a bit of it when I was a young fella, so I know the basics of rugby. I know the basic goal, if you'll excuse the pun, of rugby is to score a try. And then if you get a try, there's the possibility of a conversion. But after that, unless you're on the field of play rugby gets extremely hard to follow. You see, the rules of rugby are entirely illogical. In order to go forward, you must throw the ball backwards. You can tackle as if you want to kill the opposition in rugby, but if you ever kill the ball, it's always considered an offence. You can win possession of a ball in a ruck, even if your team hasn't touched the ball, as long as you're the team making progress along the ground. A maul exists when you're on your feet, a ruck when you are not. And interestingly, you can't enter either of them if it is judged by the ref that your head and your shoulders are lower than the height of your hips. You can claw a player who's lying on the ground using your foot, as long as that's not considered an act of stamping, which is obviously illegal. You cannot play the ball in rugby when you're on the ground, but you can, when tackled, turn with the same ball and position it on your own side of play, and that's not considered to be playing it. That's not even to mention the new rules of rugby, which mean when you tackle a player, you must release the player for a moment before you try and re-engage to get the ball. Rugby, unless you're involved in the midst of the action, is a game that's very hard to understand. And then, like the rest of us sitting in the stand, you look down at the ref and you figure that person, because they're out in front of everybody else, they'll make sense of the game for me. But quickly we realize that's not the case. Because if you're looking for a rugby referee to try and make sense of a game, obviously with the gesticulations and the arm movements, oftentimes rugby refs look far more like someone backing a plane into a parking spot than they are someone who's refereeing a game. It can be hard to understand what's going on in the field in front of us. But lest you think that I'm going to talk just about sport for the day, I'm not. What I will say is that sport and a lot of other things that we do in life make no sense unless you throw yourself wholeheartedly into the midst of the action, unless you're on, figuratively or literally, the field of play. Faith, however, is just like sport. Faith, from the vast majority of people's perspective, one would be led to believe in today's culture, in today's society, in today's Ireland, is totally illogical. But the good news is that faith is illogical. I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest so are you. Think for a moment about what you're doing here today. You have all given up a perfectly good Saturday morning. If you plan to go to the under-21, you've put yourself under pressure for time to get away from here to there. If you weren't going to the under-21, there was 1,000 other things that you could have been doing with today. And for some illogical reason, you came here to listen to a talk. Some Wally you've never heard of from Kilkenny, standing in front of the room, talking raw maish, going on about points that you have yet to see the relevance of faith and culture. If you had any real desire to understand about faith in a changing culture, and you had any real desire to engage with that topic in a real fashion, would it not be more logical for you to have gone to a library? In a library, you could dictate the pace of what you were doing. You could decide what is relevant and what is irrelevant. You could see what you want to read and what you think is surplus to requirements, but you didn't. You came here, and you get to listen to my agendaed talk about faith in a changing culture. You get to listen to what I think is important to engage on this topic, not what you think. That's an entirely illogical thing for someone to do if they actually wanted to learn something about the subject matter in hand. And lest you think that that made you illogical, there's even worse to come. You sat last night in a cathedral and did something that was totally and utterly illogical. You launched a pastoral plan for a group of people, for a church that is losing its numbers, for pews that are empty, and you're planning. What are you planning for? It seems like an illogical thing to do, and if that's not mad enough, think for a second about the way you behaved when you were in that church last night. You sang and you danced, you lit candles, you darkened it, you had smells and bells to a God who has taken the precaution of never introducing himself to you, to a God who you've never seen with your own eyes, and yet because you're illogical or limited in your intellect, you decided to sit down there, put yourself in his company, and engage in a conversation with him. Faith is illogical, but thankfully so are you illogical, obviously, or else the church wouldn't exist. But the presupposition that faith is illogical is based on the understanding that God doesn't exist. Yes, it's entirely illogical for a group of sane people to walk into a nice ornate building last night, to sit well-behaved and well-dressed in pews and engage in a dialogue with a God who you haven't seen. That's completely and utterly illogical if your God doesn't exist. However, if your God does exist, then it's entirely illogical not to put yourself in a situation where you can engage with them and talk with him. If your God does exist, then you're certifiably mad and not just illogical if you don't want to engage with him. If your God does exist, the person who gave you the very lifeblood of your being, and you won't give an hour or an hour and a half to share some ideas about what it might mean in today's world, if you won't give a half an hour a day to sit in his company in prayer, then you're certifiably mad. Then you're entirely illogical. If our God does exist, it is fundamental that we engage with him, and the imperative then becomes, just like in sport, that we become involved. Acknowledging the reality of an all-powerful being gives to us the imperative to become involved in our church, in our community, and more immediately in our own faith. But if we are mad to be following God, we're not the first in a line of mad people. We continue a very wonderful tradition of people who are mad to engage with him at all in the first place. Think randomly of some passages from Scripture. People will persecute you and speak all kinds of calumny against you on my account. We hear quoted of Jesus in Luke. Why would he bother to tell the disciples, who were obviously engaged in the mission that he was with, who believed in what he was doing, that people will persecute you and speak all kinds of calumny against you? Because it seems he or they were probably already experiencing that people thought what they were doing was illogical. What happens then when the person that they believed in, the one they trusted in, the one whose vision they tried to animate and live out, when he was taken from their midst, what did they do then? Did they return to their friends and their family, to the places you would think they are safest? No. These people were so illogical that what they had to do was go and hide for fear of the Jews. And if that doesn't seem a strange thing to do, to hide for fear of the Jews, they were hiding why? Because they believed. Who were they hiding from? Another group of illogical people who believed. So not even was their faith illogical to a society who didn't believe, but it was illogical to a society of believers. So their alienation was all the more compounded. We are following in the footsteps of people who are prepared to be, in inverted commas, illogical for their faith. So what then is the imperative for us and our faith today? What should I do if I believe, and I do, that God exists, and I believe that I'm right to spend my time in dialogue with God in ornate buildings, with smells and bells, and with song and with dancing? What should I do about that faith, and how do I offer it to the world? Should we spend our time and energy trying to explain the logic of my faith to a society that sees it illogical? Should I spend my time offering an apologetic, an explanation for the why of my faith, for why it is important and what it is all about? Should we spend our time trying to show others just how beautiful it is to believe? Are these the things we should be doing in our church today? No, no, and no again. They're an utter waste of time. They're not the priority for faith in a world today that's trying to show its beauty to the world. There was a Danish philosopher, Søren Kierkegaard, who wrote, he died over 100 years before the council, and he was Lutheran. But over 100 years before the council, he had a massive insight into the faith that I think still answers a question for us today. He said that our faith was not some mere dogma which could be meditated, but rather it was individually a subjective passion. It was something that we must be prepared to throw ourselves into. Think again from my opening analogy about hurling. Yes, I thought it was strange that Barry Kelly was giving out yellow cards, but I was removed from the action up in the stand and have no idea what he saw or heard down on the field of play. If I want to know what it is to play rugby, if I want to know what it is to play hurling, I need to put on a set of boots and togs and throw myself in the middle of the action, because only then will that sport make sense. In the same fashion, Kierkegaard reckoned that if we want to understand our faith, I cannot stand outside of a church, look inside and wonder what are these believers doing and why are they doing it. I must throw myself into the middle of it, become a believer, and then try to figure out what is happening around me. Only when we're in the midst of the action will the action begin to make sense. Kierkegaard was saying this over 100 years before the Second Vatican Council. And we laud the Second Vatican Council at events like this, saying that it was a wonderful occasion which brought great clarity to our faith. It didn't. it confused the life out of us. And it continues to confuse us because it took a simple and clear faith and it muddied the waters. Prior to the Second Vatican Council, the faith of our fathers was a very simple faith. People believed, and they believed in numbers. And by numbers, I mean, first of all, that they believed in vast quantities. So my faith supported me as a person, but then the faith of other persons supported my personal faith. So I was not seen to be separate from society or illogical, because the faith of everybody else not only supported, but also literally augmented my own faith. The numbers of people attending confraternities, sodalities, attending benediction in a church, attending prayer gatherings, rosaries, whatever it was that was going on, that simple, clean faith of our fathers, that was supported by the numbers who were in attendance. But the council comes along and takes it away in somewhat. You see, prior to the council, and this is a very facile way of presenting it, but it has to be done in order to stir some thought. Prior to the council, faith was simply belief in a group of propositions. If someone could stand up and say, I believe in God the Father Almighty, I believe in Jesus Christ, His only Son, our Lord, I believe in the afterlife, they were Christian. If they could go on and say, I believe in the dogmas around Mary, they were Catholic. If you could assent to a certain series of propositions, you were considered to be a believer. Do you believe in God? Tick that box, yes, I do. Do you believe in Jesus Christ, His only Son, our Lord? Tick that box, yes, I do as well. And tick enough boxes and suddenly here's your card of membership. You're a Christian, you're a Catholic, you're a member of the church. The council came along and messed it all up because the language of proposition around faith became a more personalist conversation. People no longer believe simply in numbers around faith, but now had to talk about a God who was a little bit more nebulous. Prior to the council, people believe now in numbers 2 and 2 times 2 is 4 and 2 times 4 is 8 because they were taught that in school. But in the same fashion, you were taught in school things about your faith. And no more than you parsed or tried to dissect the knowledge that you received in maths, you didn't try and parse or dissect the knowledge you received around your faith. We have a certificate in theology offered from Maynooth in Kieran's College. And one of the lads that I teach with, who shall remain nameless, not to embarrass him, told me that he signed up to do this because he was half thinking of also trying to add religion to his teaching. And so he went to the first night and the second night and the third night, and eventually he came to me and he said, do you know what's going on down there, Dermot? It's mad. He said, all the things I was taught all my way through school, the lads are asking questions about. For him, it was entirely illogical, and he's only in his 20s, that anybody would be asking questions about your faith. Sure, don't you just believe? Isn't it simple? Sure, don't you just hurl for the parish? Who else would you hurl for? Why would you question it? Why would you question if God cares for me? Why would you question if God is involved in my life? Don't you just believe it? This was the simple faith that was offered to a people prior to the council. After the council, it became far more nebulous. Ironically, because God came closer to us, or was offered to us in a closer way, but the closer God became, the more harder it became to understand him. God, like any person, slowly revealed himself in relationship, but as he revealed himself, he seemed to be further away. You see, God wasn't just Father, Judge, and someone removed, but now God was something like a person, something we could engage with, a friend, a counselor, a comforter. God was kind. We have the story of the man born blind, and that's lovely and reassuring. But God was also exacting. He wasn't just a kind and benign God. He was the God who of a day got thick in a temple, turned over the tables and chairs, and pushed everybody out. We could look at that and say, wasn't it wonderful? God went in and defended his Father's house. It was wonderful, unless you were the wife of one of the sellers who that morning was saying, in the name of God, what did you go and buy another table for? We can't afford to feed the kids. Mary, don't worry your head about it at all. Market sales are going to be great in the temple today. Not only will I pay for the table and the new baskets that I bought, but we're moving house when I come home tonight. No, you're not, because you've got negative equity biblical fashion. Jesus has broken your table and chairs, so you have to pay for that back, but you can't go back into the temple to sell it because he's raised questions about it. This is your God who was kind. God, as he became closer, became more difficult. You see, our God is welcoming. That's what I was taught in school. Think of the good thief on the cross. He had done something wrong. So he was told, this day you will be with me in paradise. That's fine. But the same God is also the Wally who turned around and said to the man who's, I've done everything, Lord. What do you want me to do now? Go and sell everything you have and give it to the poor. Bugger. Why do I have to go another step? Why are you expecting more out of me? Have I not done enough? Is it not simple? God was forgiving Zacchaeus. We all know the lovely story of calling Zacchaeus down from the tree. But God was also fairly distant and harsh. He's the same God who had a bet with Satan and sat back and looked at Job. Let's see how he'll handle the suffering. You see, the closer God came to us in one way, the closer he presented himself to us, the harder he became to understand. God was then and is now what we all are, a little bit complex. But that's what God should be. Because if we believe God to be a person, and we do, then it's only natural that people are complicated. As was said, I teach a couple of courses in college, and I always tell my students, when talking about the Trinity and how God reveals himself to us, that think of the way God reveals us as to the way you would when you're out in the pool in a pub in the night time. If you walk up and meet a man or a woman and you begin to have a drink with them and talk with them, and they tell you their entire life story in 30 seconds, finish your pint and move to another bar. People who reveal that much of themselves that quickly are certifiable. We know this in practice in daily life and we're okay with it, so why shouldn't we be okay with it in our faith? Why do I expect God to have presented himself in his entirety 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago? Why am I not okay with him revealing himself gradually to my limited intellect over a period of time in a way that I can have some difficulties but also come to some solutions? We should, therefore, with Kierkegaard in mind, be prepared to embrace a nebulous God. But trying to embrace a cloud, a nebulous, is something that is hard to do because I can see it, I know it's there, but the minute you go and you try and touch it, it dissipates. How can we engage with trying to hold on to this God that's a God who's not prepared to be held on to? Unless we're starting to feel sorry for ourselves and say it's only since the time of the council that things got difficult and my grandparents and my parents had it so much easier because they could tick a load of boxes, it wasn't. Think back to the time of the New Testament, the first in the series of mad people who decided to follow Jesus. They had it just as difficult as well, because the God that they had presented to them in the Old Testament was X, the God that they had revealed to them in the New Testament was Y, and the difference and distance between the two was immense. It was immense, so immense that those who believed in X, the Old Testament, thought those who were believing in Y, the New Testament, were entirely illogical. Remember what I said? When Jesus died, they couldn't return to their believing friends and family. Why? They went for fear of the Jews. It was so disparate, so different a reality, that they couldn't even return to them for comfort and consolation. I invariably find when you're doing a lot of talking, you burn out your throat, so I'm going to back off talking a bit and involve you for a second. You've all seen or heard of catchphrase on TV. If you say exactly what you're seeing, then you'll be right. These are two images. The first up on the top, on the right-hand side, is an image from the Old Testament. The one on the bottom, on the left-hand side, is an image from the New Testament. There's a fabulous church in Rome, St. John Lateran, and there's beautiful statues of the 12 apostles all around the church. But because of the magnificence and the beauty of these statues, people rarely notice the reliefs which are above them. The artist, quite cleverly, in a series of reliefs on the left and right all the way up along the church, has placed an Old Testament story directly opposite a New Testament story. Keep in mind a God who slowly reveals himself. God who told us something about himself in the Old Testament and how that something is progressed or developed in the New Testament in a way that adds to the revelation or the understanding of God. So if I was to ask you what you see in the first, the Old Testament image, so it's the higher one on the right, and anyone hazard a guess at what story it may be? No, not quite. It's the angel. Someone said it a second ago. Exactly that. It's the angel kicking people out of the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve have done something is wrong. So my Old Testament God, who I want to compartmentalize and know, do I understand him and analyze him? It's very simple. You do something wrong, get out of the garden. Not only get out of the garden, but I'm going to stick an angel here at the gate to ensure that you don't come back in. Very clear, I understand God. That's good. I can move on with the rest of my day. Until I come to the New Testament God. The story in the New Testament that might confuse that understanding from the Old Testament. What's the story? What about the crucifixion might confuse an understanding of God who says you've sinned, get out of the garden? The good thief. Think for the good thief for a second. The people of New Testament times, their go-to reference was the Old Testament for understanding the faith. If somebody walks into Kilkenny, into one of the hospitals today and starts curing people, I'll immediately think that's very like Jesus, because that's my reference point for miraculous things like that. In the New Testament times, when something happened that was in the faith context, their reference point was the Old Testament. So I'm hearing a story of Jesus on the cross and a thief admitting, do you know what? You don't deserve to be here, but I do because I've done something wrong. My Old Testament God would say very clearly, get out of the garden, you've done something wrong. But the New Testament God says something different. This day you will be with me in paradise. The direct inverse of what the Old Testament God seemed to be saying, inviting the person into the garden. Old Testament story in the top on the right, and New Testament story at the bottom. That's supposed to be a boat up in the background of the Old Testament story, so it should give it away. Noah's Ark, the Old Testament story which tells us how God will deal with people who have sinned. He will wash clean and we will start again. What's the New Testament story, or what's happening? Baptism. The baptism of Jesus in the Jordan. So the Old Testament understanding of God is very clear. It's simple. If you do something wrong, God will wash away the project and he's going to start again. In the New Testament understanding of God, God will wash away the problem and start again, but in an entirely more nuanced way. It's a washing of baptism, a cleansing from sins. Not nearly as dramatic, not nearly as effective, in inverted commas, as the Old Testament understanding, but maybe more effective and more dramatic in a different way in the New Testament times. Old Testament story up on the top, on the right. Sacrifice of Isaac. God needs to be appeased in the Old Testament, so the only way to appease God is to take someone good and to sacrifice him. So Abraham is prepared to sacrifice Isaac until the angel stops him. God needs to be appeased. A son is needed to bring about the appeasing in the New Testament. What's the story on the bottom? It's the carrying of the cross and the story of Jesus in the New Testament. A God who still needs to be appeased for sin and for our wandering from him, but now God is offering his own son to do the appeasing. God is no longer distant and removed, but God is part of the solution that he is offering. God is prepared to get his hands dirty, to walk the mile, to journey with people. Old Testament story on the top. It also is a musical. Joseph, a guy who was innocent, being betrayed by those who should love him, his brothers. God is telling the story, he's at a remove. Again, in the New Testament, God is closer. Who's being betrayed? Jesus. Jesus is being betrayed by Judas in the Garden of Gethsemane. So God is no longer distanced and removed, but now getting closer and closer to his people, and in doing so, in inverted commas, compromising himself. He is being affected by the story of humanity as it plays out. New Testament story up on the top, or Old Testament, sorry, on the top. It's a story of being led from slavery. Moses in the Exodus leading people from slavery. The New Testament story down on the bottom, the only slavery left, in inverted commas, to humanity at that time was death. Who's doing the leading here? Jesus. Jesus broke the last of the slaveries of humanity by pulling people out of it. Again, a God who is distant and removed and easy to understand. If you sin against God, he will kick you out of the garden. If you make a mistake, God will wash you away and we'll all start this project over again. All of these removes of God are in the New Testament times in a simple, human, but completely radical way turned up on their head. Because God comes and he stands in the midst of the action and he gets his own hands dirty. We're now coming to the point of bringing all these random thoughts about sport and God together in some breed of a synthesis. I should hopefully at this point have teed up two different things. First of all is this: unless you're involved in it, whatever that it is, it will make no sense. So there is a guy who teaches in Kieran's with me, and he doesn't believe. And he's grand, and he's great crack, and he's great fun. But anything I do that is faith-related is totally illogical to him. Absolutely and utterly illogical. Because he begins with the presupposition that God does not exist. So everything that I do then is illogical, to the point at which he questions why intelligent people would be bothered to be involved with God. If you're not involved in it, it will make no sense. And the second thing that we must accept is that our God is a person. And like any person, our God is complicated and is slowly revealing himself to us, and we are entering into relationship with that God. So then, how can we engage with faith in the changing culture? We must do this: introduce people to God. Because unless they know him, they can't be involved in it. And unless they're not involved in it, they can't progress to relationship with him. People desire something spiritually in today's world. There is no doubt about it. Everybody, believer and unbeliever alike, has this part of their being that longs for something else. For the Christian, we sate that desire by knowledge of God, but we know even our limited knowledge of God doesn't fully seem to sate it. We are, ironically, baptized into a relationship with God, presuming that we have had an encounter with him, when obviously as infants it is physically impossible for us to have had an encounter with him. The people of the New Testament, who were mad like the rest of us, had it much easier than us because they met Jesus and then decided to follow him in relationship. You were all cursed at birth, predominantly. I'm presuming that you were baptized then, because you were baptized into a relationship with a God that you hadn't met. And you spent the rest of your life, and you're spending the rest of your life, trying to meet this God with whom you're supposed to have a relationship. So the imperative for faith in a changing culture becomes about offering a real possibility of encounter with people for their God. Introducing people to God so that they can get to understand this God that they're supposed to have a relationship. So the first thing you'd say about trying to do anything about faith in a changing culture is to think radically outside the box. And how is it that we can introduce people to God in ways that are, like our society and our world, ever new and ever different? We must make God known. There is no alternative for faith, for church, for a believing community today other than to radically, not notionally, radically, not nominally, radically make God known. To actively, in every waking moment of every day as a believing community, desire and do something about introducing people to God and to make him known. We can no longer, in an Ireland of today, presuppose that our schools are doing it, in spite of the fact that our schools are doing an immensely wonderful job in teaching religion in primary and in secondary school. And I have very real experience of the wonderful job that they're doing in both spheres. But we cannot presume it, because even if a wonderful job is done up until the time a person is 18, their understanding of life, their maturity, their development psychologically, all of that will continue to mature after 18. So is it not also commensurate that we should presume that their faith will continue to develop and mature after they're 18? But it doesn't. Because in the vast majority of situations, we don't offer people the chance to develop their relationship with God after they leave formal religious education in school. And the second part of it then is to radically get stuck in. I couldn't understand Barry Kelly's decision because I was standing in the stand. I can't complain about a half backline that are being cleaned if I've got my two hands buried in my pockets and feeling grand and warm, while they're down there getting a slap of a slither on a cold thigh and feeling the sting. Unless you get stuck into the action, you cannot understand what is going on. So we have to offer some way for the society that we have to offer people the chance to get stuck in to meet this God. How do we do it? The reality is that the key point of contact for the vast majority of people for their faith is Mass. One of the priests in my own diocese reckons that as a church we suffer from mastitis. Every single chance we get, we throw Mass at the occasion. Father, the junior B team are hurling, we'll bring them to Mass on Saturday night before they go. Father, it's my mother's month's mind, we'll have Mass on Saturday night. Father, there's exams coming up, we'll have Mass on Saturday night. We continually throw Mass as the answer to all our needs of catechesis, all our needs of prayer. I'm not against the Mass for obvious reasons. But let me ask you this. The priests are all looking this way, so if you're sitting back there, you can get away with it. Hands up how many people who have attended a boring Mass in their lifetime. My next question is this. Hands up how many people who have attended a boring funeral in their lifetime. The reality is that the vast amount of people who would, I'd say all of us, have attended boring masses. But when we ask the same question about a boring funeral, the number is considerably lessened. What then is the variable between the two? Because it's the same priest, with the same boring monotone, with the same ideas that he had when he came out of college, with the same thought process that's going on week in, week out. What is it that's different between the boring mass and the boring funeral? Me, the person. The only variable in that is the person who's experiencing the mass. So what then is it about my encounter with the funeral that's so different from my encounter with mass? It is this, emotion. If you want to understand why I wouldn't get in the plane and go to America this summer, if my friends need to understand that, be born in Kilkenny. Hurling is life. I'm emotionally involved in the sport. I'm passionate about it. Therefore, it's logical for me to stay around. If I attend a funeral, I know the person who is dead. I know the family. I worked with them. I met them when I was younger. I have some emotional involvement with what is taking place in front of me. Therefore, I'm stuck into the middle of the action. Even if I'm standing at the back of a cold church on a cold winter's night, I'm some way engaged with what's going on. So the only variable is us, so that then becomes the only thing we need to worry about educating. So we need to involve people some way emotionally in the faith. Now, for the thinking person, the question then becomes, which comes first? Which is the cart? Do we educate people to become involved in their faith, or do we get people involved and then educate them after the fact? I'm from Kilkenny. I'd hedge my bets. Why would you put all your eggs in one basket? I was working in parish up until recently, until I went into the school. And invariably, it was my experience that if you involved someone in some practical element of parish life, invariably they became involved in some impractical element of parish life. And equally, if you educated people about their faith, invariably they became involved in some practical element of parish life. So do both. Do not walk around your parish and only engage with those people who come to faith talks or engage with faith development or turn up to the Eucharist of a Sunday or a Saturday night, but also when you need a plumber for a local board of management or when you need someone to fix something in the church, think outside the box and ask the young fellow with a young family in your parish and get them involved in the community then. Because Lord knows when they're doing something and putting them in the midst of the action, they may slowly see that that which looked illogical from the outside begins to look logical from the inside. Because it's as simple as human contact. Why are the parishes where the priest attends hurling matches so successful? Not because the priest has any great knowledge of hurling, because in the vast majority of situations we don't, but because we're encouraged and engaged and involved with people where people are. In the same inverse way, involve people in our world. Not by forcing them to come into something that seems radically different, but by showing that our world is logical and makes just as much sense as theirs. A little German fellow called Karl Rahner wrote about this over 50 years ago in an article entitled How to Receive a Sacrament and Mean It. He had a profoundly simple thought, but profoundly good. It was this, that one of the problems with faith is that it's perceived in two different worlds. You see, I'll do what I do outside and I get on with my life, and then of a Sunday I put on a good clothes and I come into Mass and I go through my religious thing. And then I come back out and I go out again. Even if we go back to the faith of our fathers, in inverted commas, back to the prayer, to the council, there was still a disconnect between those two worlds. Because I, as a sacramental theologian once taught me when I was in college, I stepped out of my profane world, my ordinary world, to pull into the petrol station of the church, to receive a fill-up of grace, the sacrament, and when I had enough juice on board, out I went and back into my world again. But the two worlds are radically separate. Rahner poses the challenge that if we bring those two worlds together, then they will start to make sense of each other. Why does the God of a Good Friday make sense to so many people, more so than the God of an Easter vigil? Because most people live life that is touched by Good Fridays each and every day. I understand a God who's suffering on Good Friday because I'm suffering in my world. I can relate to a God who's suffering in the church because I understand suffering in my world. I have experienced, and you will probably experience it today and hopefully again next week or 2 weeks' time, the elation of winning on All-Ireland. But, and I find it hard to believe, it seemingly is a country mile away from how elated we will be when we're resurrected. So I can't really relate to a God who's resurrected. I relate to a God who is suffering, a God who is more real. So Karl Rahner suggests that we bring those two worlds together and make that which we do in the sacred very much practical for the profane. How do we do it? Again, I go back to what Kieran says in Kilkenny the priest, we suffer from mastitis. How do we make the Mass something which is sacred, happens in an ornate building, something which is ordinary and touches in my world? We're already doing it, but we don't realize we're doing it. We're doing it in spades. We do it like this, and this is how we make sense of faith in a changing culture. We realize that the Mass must be shocking ordinary in order to be what it is, truly extraordinary. Sigurd Koder is a German priest who's still alive, and he's a very famous artist, and this is his depiction of the washing of the feet. Koder takes the account that we all know, the Last Supper. Jesus gets up from table, he takes a cloth, and he goes around and he washes the disciples' feet. Here's the encounter between himself and Peter, and we know the story. Jesus gets down to wash Peter, and Peter says, "No, Lord, you're not going to wash me. Absolutely no way." And Jesus says, "Well, if I cannot wash you, you can have no part in me." So he said, "Lord, not only my head and my hands and my feet, but my head as well. And no one who is washing needs washing," etc. We know the story really well. Koder captures that story like any artist in one snapshot. But in doing so, I think he offers us a wonderful insight into what Eucharist is and how it is shocking ordinary to be truly extraordinary. It's this. At the heart or the root of this painting is water. It dominates the middle of the painting. We see that Peter's feet are buried in it. That's the beginning of the journey for Christian, baptism. So much so is this painting rooted in water that even the blue rug, which is underneath the bowl of water, looks itself as if it's got waves. Baptism permeates everything that the Christian does. It's not just a statement of some historical fact that happened to us years ago, but is something that should have begun a relationship with Jesus and should have radically begun to change us. Not changed us, but begun to change us. So rooted in baptism, then how can we progress to the rest of our understanding? We probably do like Peter. "Lord, I'm not worthy." Because if I stop and think about it for a second, really do I believe that God takes any time out of his day to listen to me whinge? Does God take any time out of his day to listen to me pray, "We'll win the next puck out"? Does God take any time out of his day to listen to my worries, my concerns, my hope, my aspirations? No, because God is infinite and I am finite. So like Peter, I go, "No, God, not me." Because I can understand he would want to engage with all of you because you're decent people, but I know me and I'm a wally, so why would he want to engage with me? But we ritualize that in the Eucharist, in the penitential rite. We begin each of our encounters in Eucharist by saying, "Lord, I am not worthy. I confess to God Almighty Father and to you, my brothers and sisters, that I have sinned. I'm acknowledging that I'm not worthy of this, and in spite of my protesting against it, we know that the Eucharist and our relationship with God continues after that fact. Our relationship with God, which has begun in baptism, is a relationship of journey. Look at the feet of Jesus. They're calloused and worn because this is a Jesus who walked on the earth. This is a Jesus who knew the understanding of pains, of trials, of tribulations of people. This is the same Jesus who wants to engage with me in my culture in Ireland of today. Not some Jesus, as Rana would say, removed in a different sacred world. Not some Jesus who's up in the stand with his hand buried in his pockets looking in on the action, but a God who's radically journeying with me and therefore is concerned with what I do. The next interesting thing that Koder has is the towel that was used to wipe and dry the feet is represented here almost like a Jewish prayer shawl. An accident, I don't know. But maybe what the artist is telling us is that the work we do, think again of my friend the plumber who you're involving in the parish just for the sake of pulling them in, think of the work that we do as all being the use of God's gifts and talents. We notionally accept the understanding that all of us have charisms and gifts from God, but we presume that to be something holy and spiritual over there. But is it not equally a gift from God to be a wonderful hurler, to be a great mother, to be an outstanding father, to be a level head at a board of management, to be someone committed and inspired to be training under 12s in a rugby field or under 10s on a hurling field? Are they not talents that are God-given as well? Are they not the sacred bits and pieces, not just mere towels, but bits of prayer in everyday life? Our Mass is not nearly as removed from our everyday existence as we might like to see. Because if Koder wants you to get to the bread and wine in this image, the Eucharist, you have to go through the water. You have to engage with the service that is happening in the front of the picture before you can get to the back. And the last point is this. The face of Jesus is found only in one place in this painting, distorted in the dirty water. I think it is wonderful that we have readers, Eucharistic ministers, sacristans, people who prepare the church, people who are knocking around after, people who welcome, people who serve tea and coffee. The multiplicity of roles that happen within the celebration of a Eucharist, we have all of these things, and yet we focus on just one, the sacramental role of the priest. Embrace all the others, because it's all the others that will get me emotionally involved in the celebration of the Eucharist. Think of what I was saying about the funeral. Because I'm sitting in the back of the church, and Mary, who was in the shop yesterday and kept talking to me for 10 minutes, and as a result I was running late and the spuds were boiled over, she's doing the reading. But now I know Mary. Frank, who I saw at the match last week, and actually he's not from the parish at all, he shouldn't be here because he was born and bred in the neighbouring parish, and anyway his son is hurling for the other parish, and what's he doing here? He's given out Eucharist. Again, I'm emotionally involved. John Joe, who I know from bingo on a Monday night, is at the door saying, how are you getting on? Take a newsletter, lads, it's a cold one out there tonight. It's a small human contact, but it's a friendly face of someone I know as I walk into the church. We are trying to engage with faith in a world in some notional, some abstract, some construct of an idea, when if we embrace the reality that we already have, the things that we already have extant in our parishes, extant in our liturgy, then we already have the tools to make sense of a God, to introduce God to a people who are mad to engage with him, to allow people to engage with a reality with a God who loves them. I should finish with a quote from Pedro Arrupe. He was one of the Father Generals of the Jesuits. He said, "Nothing is more practical than finding God than falling in love in a quite absolute and final way." Why? What you are in love with, what seizes your imagination, will affect everything. It will decide what you get out of bed for in the morning, what you do with your evenings, how you spend your weekends, what you read, whom you know, what breaks your heart and what amazes you with joy and gratitude. Fall in love, stay in love, and it will decide everything. Thank you.